Good afternoon, people of grace. I'm taking this Thursday for our next Pastoral Connect, and I wanted to talk with you a little bit about some things from Psalm 42. Psalm 42 is a very familiar passage for us. It's the psalm that starts off with, "As a deer pants for flowing streams, so pants my soul for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and see the face of my God?" There's a lot in this psalm that's very powerful as we start to really kind of get what he's saying, kind of on a deeper level. He starts off with this description of his own soul. And he describes his soul as something that's panting for flowing streams like a deer, panting for God. It thirsts for the living God. It just wants to see the face of God. And I don't want to take a bunch of time today to really go in depth about the human soul, which is our self, our awareness, really who we are. But a more thorough study would help me kind of unpack for you what are kind of three levels to the human soul. There's the fearing self, the fearing part, and that's what went awry from us once we fell in the Garden of Eden. We no longer delight in the fear of the Lord. Not that we don't ever experience that, but fear for us is overwhelmingly negative. But there's this kind of gut level, primal, fearing level of awareness. Then there's this delighting level of awareness, and then there's this analyzing level of awareness. And a lot of what's happened in the Western world, especially over really quite a few centuries, is we've taken this analyzing part, which is incredibly important and incredibly valuable, but we've kind of equated that with being spiritual. We've made the intellect spiritual, and the other things are sort of like merely animalistic. And that's just not true. That's bad theology. And really, the deeper part of us is the fearing part and the delighting part. These are the things that really even just help us think clearly. When those parts of us are properly aligned, then our thinking flows. Now, because we are disintegrated, all three parts of these are all over the place. And sometimes the best we can do is just try to analyze scripture correctly and try to just like knuckle down and keep these other parts in their place, so to speak. But that's not actually health. That's what we do when we lack health, to try to keep us from acting out badly. And it can be quite damaging. And it isn't where the psalmist starts. He starts with this part that I need to delight in God. And I need to see the face of God. Now, we know from Scripture we really can't see the face of God in our current state, as Moses desired, and God said, well, that would kill you. But there is a promise in Revelation 21 and 22 that one day we will see the face of our God. We will see his face, and he will wipe every tear from our eyes. And between now and then, we can see the glory of God in the face of Christ. And Paul talks about that in 2 Corinthians 3 and 4, that we can have unveiled faces and really see the beauty and the wonder and the splendor of the glory of God in the face of Christ. And so be transformed ourselves from glory to glory. That's what the psalmist is really just passionate about and wanting to experience. But it comes down to this delighting part of our soul. It's kind of like the fearing part is the gut, the delighting part is the heart, and the analyzing part is the intellect. And out of that delighting part of us are the streams of life. And that's the part that gets squeezed, especially in hard times. That part wants to see the face of God. That's in verses 1 and 2, and I'm not going to go through all the verses because we don't have time. But in verse 4, he also reminds that his own soul, and especially focusing on the delighting part of the soul, that he needs community. that he needs to go with the throng into the house of God and be in community and sing shouts of praise and songs of praise, glad shouts of the whole multitude keeping festival, joy, celebration, community. And we're getting squeezed in that area because we're not yet allowed to assemble. So all of us are missing something that's very, very important to our heart, to this delighting part of our soul. Not only that, we're going through a very severe trial with this whole COVID-19 and everybody trying to figure out the best way to move forward with that. And the psalmist talks about his own soul squeeze in verse 5. He talks about how, why is my soul cast down within me? Why is it so disquieted? Why is it so full of turmoil? And the idea of cast down there really is just depressed. But the part I wanted to focus on was this disquieted part, this turmoil part, because that part is like a sea that's all churned up. That part is really kind of contrasted with a submissive soul, a well-ordered soul. See, all of this tumult started when one being, Satan, did not stay well-ordered in his soul and his delights and really find satisfaction in the place God had for him, but delighted or willed or desired to step out of that place. And now we have all this tumult in our world, or anxiety, or a churning and an inability to be satisfied. Those are signs that the inner part of us, this heart part of us, is getting squeezed. And if you take someone, for example, who's had like PTSD or something like that, what's happened with them is for so long they've gone right from the fearing part and then hyper analyzing and kind of bypassing this landscape of the heart and the delighting and the emotional part. And if you do that long enough, you break. And there are some signs that you're breaking. And as the psalmist continues to unpack this psalm, you see him talking about how all these breakers and these waves are washing over me. But the psalmist makes a very, very important point in verse 7 as he talks about that. Ultimately, he says that they're God's breakers. He says, your breakers and your waves have gone over me. And the psalmist makes that connection, says, hold on. God has, at the very least, allowed me to experience this, so I can't dodge that. I have to let myself feel that and work through that to get to verse 8, where the Lord commands his steadfast love, and at night his song is with me. And there's the song, there's the delighting again, even at night. But I have to figure out this part where the waterfalls and the breakers and the waves are washing over me. And in that part, right as he leads into that, at the beginning of verse 7, he says, deep calls to deep. Deep calls to deep. See, we just want to jump from I feel threatened to let me analyze this. And again, it's not that any one part of the soul is innately more important than another part, but you can't skip steps. The only time that you should skip how you feel about something is when you literally have no time. For example, a real life violent encounter. Then you go right from the fear spike to analyze, deal with the threat, avoid, and you can figure out how you feel about it later and just allow that fear to empower you to act. But we're not supposed to live that way. And what are some signs that we're living that way, that we've lost touch with our own hearts? Well, you see it in people when things happen and they're easily provoked, meaning they're not able, they go right from that initial, that feels threatening to me, to kind of attack mode and debate mode and argument mode, and trying to make points to say why it's okay that they feel threatened by that. And they may be right, they may be wrong, but love is not easily provoked until we get to that more grounded place, deep calling to deep. Even if we're right, we're wrong, because uh, you know, in the worst case of that, it would be like the Pharisees, who might have been correct on a lot of their doctrines as best as we understand their theological system. They were probably the most aligned with Jesus' own convictions on things, but they were the most estranged from him emotionally. And they weren't willing to really unpack that or why they felt so easily provoked by this guy. So if you're easily provoked, if you're dogmatic and argumentative over secondary things, um, that's, of course, there's a big debate. What's secondary things? But I don't want to get into that today. But it's amazing how spiked up we get on things that don't really matter in the end. They're things we can sort out once we get to heaven. And we all are not seeing in the glass darkly. And we all need to think through them. We have an intellect, we have a mind, we need to figure out our position on them. But you see people who just, and then they're in. And they might catch themselves, and hopefully we do, but it's not healthy. And we need to realize that my ability to analyze this isn't really as deep as the deep calling to the deep in the tumult and in the storm, and being in this place um, of experiencing God's presence and not needing the emotions to go away. Um, that that's deep, and that's what Psalm 42 is talking about. And that's really what I want to leave you with today when we come to Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. It says, talking about Jesus, that for the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame. And so he sat down at the right hand of God. And without even realizing it, we slip right into the intellectual mode, which tends to be very linear. And so we say, well, what Jesus did is he could foresee the glory that was out there. And so he could push through all this pain as the iron-willed warrior stoic and get through it and get to the glory. And that's not untrue. Uh, there is that linear sense that I talked about just a couple minutes ago about how when we get there, then we will actually see God face to face. But that's not really the point of Hebrews 12. And again, I don't want to dig too much into the technical side of it, but really what the author is saying that made Jesus the master was that he could exchange the joy of emotionally always feeling God's presence for the shame of our sin emotionally. That it was very much a present tense focus, and he could embrace that. And that showed his true depth. And he can embrace that without intellectually being able to process it at that moment. My God, why have you forsaken me? His intellect couldn't keep up with the waves of things that he was feeling on that heart level, that delighting level of his soul. And it wasn't delightful. It was emotionally overwhelming. And that's Lucy barking. So, hey, Lucy. Um, so his depth was shown in his ability to emotionally exchange the joy of the presence for the shame of the cross. And then the author of Hebrews talks about the discipline of training. And that passage in Hebrews 12 is saying that this is the capstone of our faith. Hebrews 11 is the Hall of Faith chapter. And ultimately, Hebrews 12 is saying, as much as these people before set examples for you, don't really primarily look at them, look at Jesus, because Jesus is the beginner and the ender, the author and finisher of our faith. And he gained that emotional self-awareness to not be able to not have to avoid walking out of that felt sense of the Father's presence. That's what the psalmist is aspiring to in Psalm 42, as these waves wash over him. And I think what the psalmist experienced a glimpse of. But Jesus is the master. And as we stay in this COVID pandemic and start going through the initial stages of just lock everything down to, well, at what point do we start to re-engage life, even though that'll be scary and risky? There's probably a lot of stuff that's going to come out that's going to be very troubling about our world. And we can't lock down forever. Don't misinterpret that statement. I'm not protesting the current lockdown. I'm saying that's not a long-term solution. Sooner or later, we got to figure out how to live in this world. And that's going to take a lot of emotional depth and a lot of not allowing a feeling of threat to paralyze us. We have to work through that. And especially as Christians, we need to work through that. I've said it many times. Christians should be the best first responders who go toward danger, not recklessly, not foolishly, but they go toward the hard things and the scary things when everyone else is running away from it. That's what Jesus did for us on the cross. I am confident in the people of grace and our ability in our own small way to do the same thing and have the deep talk to the deep, even while these waves are washing over us. So be encouraged by that. Be courageous. Um, Let yourself see what you're feeling. Make sure you're not just kind of trying to analyze away based on what you want to be true. Whatever is going on in your soul. And if you need to talk about that, you all know how to reach me. Have a blessed day. It is a beautiful evening, and continue to hunger and thirst after the face of God.